It all began on my 21st birthday, a day meant for celebration, but one that would forever change the dynamics of my family. For years, I carried a secret, a burden entrusted to me by my grandmother, the woman who had been my anchor in life. This secret wasn't just any ordinary revelation, it was the kind that could shake the very foundation of who we were as a family. I had celebrated my 21st birthday just a few days ago, and unlike most people my age, I decided to host a quiet family dinner. No friends, no wild parties, just my family gathered around a table, completely unaware of the storm I was about to unleash. Why? Because this wasn't just a birthday dinner. This was the moment I had chosen to finally reveal the secret my grandmother had shared with me 5 years earlier. But let me take you back. 5 years ago, when I was 16, my grandmother fell gravely ill. She wasn't just my grandmother, she was my everything. The truth is, she raised me more than my own parents ever did. From the time I was 3, when my parents decided their careers were more important than being present, she stepped in. She fed me, clothed me, comforted me. For 9 whole years, while my parents were off jet-setting around the country, it was my grandmother who played the roles of mother, father, and best friend. My parents came back into my life when I was 12, but by then, the damage was done. I didn't feel connected to them, and I certainly didn't feel like I belonged in their world. My younger brother was another reminder of that disconnect. Born when I was 7, he stayed with my parents while I remained with my grandmother. It felt like there were 2 families under one roof, my parents and my brother on one side, and my grandmother and me on the other. When my father finally got a better paying job and moved us all into my grandmother's house, things didn't get easier. If anything, they got worse. My father and grandmother were constantly at odds, arguments about money, about raising me and my brother, about everything. My grandmother believed in saving and living simply, while my father thought life was meant to be lived lavishly, with extravagant vacations and designer clothes. I always sided with my grandmother, which only deepened the rift between my father and me. Then, a few days after my 16th birthday, my grandmother called me into her room. She told me to lock the door and sit down. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of what she was about to share. She said, "If anything happens to me, you need to know this. And someday, you'll have to tell your father the truth." I remember feeling my heart pound in my chest as she revealed the secret. My father wasn't her biological son. He was the child of my grandfather's first marriage, a marriage that ended when his wife ran off with my grandfather's brother, leaving behind a 1-year-old child. My grandmother, who had always loved my grandfather, married him and raised the boy as her own. She had intended to tell my father the truth when he was old enough, but time passed, and the conversation never happened. But that wasn't all. My grandmother confessed that she had recently rewritten her will. Everything, her money, the properties, all the cherished family heirlooms, would be left to me, not my father. She trusted me more, she said. She believed I understood the sentimental value of what she was leaving behind, while my father might sell it all for a quick profit. And then she said something that broke me, "I love you the most." We both cried that day, holding each other tightly, knowing it might be our last real heart-to-heart. When she passed away 3 weeks ago, I knew the time had come to fulfill her wish. As I stood before my family at that birthday dinner, I felt a wave of nerves wash over me. Would they understand? Would they forgive me for keeping this secret? Or would this revelation tear us apart? And when I finally told them, well, let's just say things didn't go as smoothly as I had hoped. When she first told me the truth, she made me promise something that felt almost impossible. She said I couldn't breathe a word of it to anyone until I turned 18 or until she passed away, whichever came first. It was a secret that weighed heavily on me, but I'll forever be grateful she fought so hard against cancer and stayed with us for 5 more precious years. Those years meant everything. She got to see me graduate from the college she always dreamed I'd attend. She was there for milestones, for laughter, for love, right up until the day she left us a few weeks ago. I'd delayed the inevitable for as long as I could, but her lawyer finally insisted the will needed to be read. My father had been pestering him daily, and excuses wouldn't hold any longer. So, on my 21st birthday, I took a deep breath and decided it was time to tell everyone. By everyone, I mean my parents, my brother, and my grandmother's youngest sister, who lived in Germany but visited once or twice a year. Her visits were always a source of joy for my grandmother, who adored reuniting with her sibling. She had also left her cherished, incredibly valuable diamond necklace to her sister, a symbol of their bond. I knew her presence would not only honor my grandmother but also provide me with much-needed emotional support for what was about to come. The evening unfolded with dinner and drinks, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Using a toast to my late grandmother as my entry point, I began to speak. My heart pounded, my words catching in my throat, but I pressed on. This was my duty, something she had entrusted to me and no one else. Finally, I revealed the secret I had carried for years. My father wasn't my grandmother's biological son. She had left everything to me, not him, and wanted him to know the truth after her passing. Along with this revelation, she had given me the contact information for his birth mother, should he ever want to reach out. But my father's reaction stunned me. He brushed aside the news about his birth mother as if it were irrelevant, zeroing in on the inheritance instead. His first question? Whether I intended to split it with him. Before I could even respond, he boldly declared that the house my grandmother had left to me was, of course, his by right. He even demanded I speak to the lawyer and begin transferring the paperwork immediately. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just any house, it was the home where I grew up, the place my grandmother and I had shared so many memories. I reminded him that everything now legally belonged to me, but he arrogantly insisted that the house was his because he had spent his childhood there. His entitlement left me reeling. He had moved out years ago, choosing a flashier address to impress his friends and colleagues, while my grandmother and I stayed behind. He had abandoned her, but I hadn't. I stood my ground. While I was open to splitting the inheritance money, the house was non-negotiable. This was my home. What followed was a heated argument, voices rising and emotions flaring. My mother joined in, and soon, my granda had to step in to prevent things from spiraling completely out of control. My parents' stance was infuriating. They argued that not only should I split the money, but I should also hand over the house to my father for sentimental reasons, as if my feelings didn't matter. As if my years in this house didn't count. And the worst part? My father tried to guilt-trip me, saying that learning the truth about his mother was a devastating shock, and I owed him this house as compensation. I couldn't take it anymore. I told them firmly that I wasn't giving up the house, no matter what. That's when they turned on me, calling me selfish and threatening to take me to court to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. It was devastating. As they left, my granda stayed with me, comforting me as I sobbed. I had already lost my beloved grandmother, the woman who meant everything to me. Now, I was being forced to choose between the rest of my family and the home that held so much of her memory. How could this be fair? My father didn't even care about this house. To him, it was just another property. I remembered how, when he moved out, he had called this house nice but found something better. He even tried to convince my grandmother to sell it so we could all move. She had refused, standing her ground, just as I would now. I'm willing to share the inheritance money, that's what he truly seems to want, but the house is different. It's my home, my sanctuary, and a piece of my grandmother's legacy that I refuse to let go. Does that make me selfish? I don't think so. I think it's about holding on to something that truly matters. Hello, everyone. It's been a few days since I last posted, and I have to admit, things are still far from resolved between my father and me regarding the inheritance. But before I dive into what's been happening these past few days, let me take a moment to say this: thank you. Truly, thank you to everyone who took the time to share advice, offer kind words, or even just listen. Your support has been invaluable, especially since this situation is far too personal to share with my friends right now. I can't express how much your encouragement has meant to me. It's been a lifeline. Now, let's get into it. Last evening, I spoke to my father. It was just the two of us this time, no call-ins from my mother and no intervention from my grandaunt to diffuse the tension. It was raw, unfiltered, and, frankly, emotionally draining. He tried to reason with me, emphasizing how he had grown up in this house long before I was born. He argued that his history with it gave him more of a claim. And then came the guilt trip. He said he'd been feeling increasingly disconnected from his mother ever since learning she wasn't his biological mother. For him, keeping the house was a way to hold onto that bond. Here's the thing, this house isn't just a sentimental relic, it's extraordinary. A gorgeous, two-story Victorian-era bungalow with intricate architecture and a picturesque picket fence. It's the kind of home that feels alive, like it has stories to tell. If I were to sell it, I'm certain it would fetch a fortune. But that's not the point, is it? It's not just about money for me. So, instead of going in circles, I asked him point blank, what do you actually plan to do with the house if I let you have it? And that's when his facade cracked. He started fumbling because we both knew the truth, he wanted to sell it. For him, the house's worth was purely financial, tied to its price tag, not its history. He tried to tell me he'd move back in, but when I pressed about what he'd do with his current home, he lost his temper. He called me nosy and said it was none of my business. His frustration only confirmed what I already knew, he wasn't going to back down. So, I stood my ground. I told him the house was rightfully mine, as per my grandmother's wishes, and that if he continued fighting me on this, the next conversation we'd have would involve our lawyers. He didn't take it well. He started yelling, but I refused to engage further. I hung up. It's been a full day since that call, and I haven't heard from him. I can't tell if he's gearing up for a legal battle or starting to accept defeat. Knowing him, though, I doubt he'll let go that easily. I wish he would. I'm too tired and heartbroken to keep fighting. On another note, I need to address something. A few people have been leaving hurtful comments about my grandmother, calling her manipulative and cunning. That's unfair, and I can't believe I even have to say this, but please stop. My grandmother wasn't perfect, but she was my rock. She never asked me for anything her entire life, except for this one difficult task, to tell my father the truth. Maybe she should have done it herself before she passed, but that doesn't make her malicious. She didn't want to leave this world with her son angry at her, even if their relationship was already strained. Speaking of the legal side of things, I've consulted with my lawyer, and she reassured me that I have nothing to worry about. Legally, my father doesn't have a claim. He's not her biological son, and he's already received his inheritance from his father. Furthermore, I was the one who cared for my grandmother during her final years. I was there through her battle with pancreatic cancer, every chemo appointment, every sleepless night. This house represents everything she was to me, and I can't imagine letting it go. Today, I arranged a meeting with my father, with our lawyers present. He arrived looking smug, probably thinking I was ready to concede. But when I told him I wasn't changing my decision, his demeanor shifted. I made it clear, the house and inheritance were mine, as per my grandmother's will, and his behavior only reinforced why he wasn't entitled to any of it. That sparked another fight. He yelled, threatened to disown me, and claimed he'd cut me out of his life entirely if I didn't relent. I accepted that. By the end of the meeting, his lawyer looked more embarrassed than anything else, and I realized I was relieved. Relieved that this chapter might finally be closing, even if it means severing ties with him. He's still threatening to take me to court, but deep down, I know he doesn't have a case. For now, I'm standing my ground. This house isn't just bricks and mortar, it's my history, my home, and a tangible connection to the woman who raised me with love and strength. If my father wants to fight, so be it. I'm not afraid anymore.